In a quiet Texas town where church bells rang every Sunday morning and neighbors knew each other's secrets, Pastor David Campbell was the man everyone trusted. He delivered sermons about love, faith, and the sanctity of marriage. But on a cold April night in 2006, his wife Liz was found dead in their bedroom. The police called it suicide. The community called it a tragedy. But one woman knew the truth, and for 4 long years, she carried a secret so dark it would shake the very foundation of faith itself. Picture this: a beloved pastor, a devoted wife, and a mistress who watched a murder unfold. This isn't just another true crime story. This is about betrayal that reached the highest levels of trust, about a man who preached salvation while planning the ultimate sin, and about a silent witness who finally found the courage to speak the truth that would send shockwaves through an entire community. What you're about to hear will make you question everything you think you know about the people you trust most, because sometimes the greatest evil hides behind the most sacred walls. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Cedar Springs, Texas was the kind of place where Friday night football games drew bigger crowds than movie theaters, where the church steeple was the tallest structure for miles, and where everyone believed they knew everyone else's business. Population 8,000, one main street, 3 traffic lights, and a community built on faith and traditional values. It was here that Pastor David Campbell built his reputation as a man of God, a devoted husband, and a pillar of the community. David wasn't your typical small-town preacher. At 38, he was charismatic, handsome, and had a way with words that could make even the most skeptical person believe. He'd arrived in Cedar Springs 8 years earlier with his wife Liz, a gentle woman with kind eyes and a smile that lit up every room she entered. Together, they seemed like the perfect couple. He preached to packed pews every Sunday while she played piano and organized church events. They had 2 beautiful daughters, and from the outside, their life looked like a Norman Rockwell painting. But as anyone who's lived in a small town knows, the most carefully constructed facades often hide the deepest secrets. Behind closed doors, the Campbell marriage was cracking under pressures that no one in their congregation could have imagined. Financial troubles had been mounting. Liz had discovered some troubling patterns in their bank statements. There were late-night phone calls that David would take in his study with the door locked. There were unexplained absences that didn't match up with his claimed church duties. Liz had confided in her sister just weeks before her death that something felt wrong. She couldn't put her finger on it, but the man she'd married was changing. He was distant, secretive, and when she asked questions, he'd respond with scripture about wives being submissive to their husbands. It was a side of David that their congregation never saw, a controlling nature that he kept carefully hidden behind his Sunday smile. The church members adored him. He was the kind of pastor who remembered everyone's name, who showed up at hospital bedsides without being asked, who could deliver a eulogy that brought tears to the eyes of strangers. But there was something else about David Campbell that no one in Cedar Springs knew. He had an insatiable appetite for attention, particularly from women, and he'd been living a double life that would have destroyed everything he'd worked to build. Her name was Vanessa Reed, a 34-year-old divorcee who'd moved to Cedar Springs 2 years earlier looking for a fresh start. She was attractive, vulnerable, and searching for meaning in her life after a painful divorce. When she started attending Grace Community Church, she was exactly the kind of person David Campbell noticed. She was lonely, she was hurting, and she was impressionable. In other words, she was perfect for a man who enjoyed wielding power over others. What started as pastoral counseling sessions quickly became something much more intimate. David told Vanessa that he felt a special calling to help her heal from her emotional wounds. He convinced her that their connection was divinely ordained, that God had brought her into his life for a purpose. It was a manipulation tactic as old as time itself, but Vanessa believed every word. She was desperate for someone to care about her, and David Campbell seemed like an answer to her prayers. Their affair began 6 months before Liz's death. They would meet in hotel rooms 2 towns over, or in David's office at the church late at night when no one else was around. David told Vanessa that his marriage was loveless, that Liz was cold and unloving, that he stayed with her only for the sake of their children and his ministry. He painted himself as a trapped man, a victim of circumstance who deserved happiness. Vanessa believed she was saving him, but as their relationship deepened, David's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would call Vanessa at all hours, demanding to know where she was and who she was with. He began talking about his wife with a venom that frightened Vanessa. He would say things like, "Liz is holding me back from God's true plan for my life," or, "Sometimes I think everyone would be better off if she just disappeared." At first, Vanessa thought he was just venting his frustrations. She had no idea that David Campbell was actually planning something unthinkable. 3 weeks before Liz's death, David told Vanessa something that would haunt her for years to come. They were lying in a hotel bed when he rolled over, looked her directly in the eyes, and said, "What if I told you that soon, very soon, we wouldn't have to hide anymore? What if Liz wasn't going to be a problem much longer?" Vanessa asked what he meant, but David just smiled and said, "Sometimes God works in mysterious ways." She should have run. She should have called the police. Instead, she chose to believe that the man she loved was just fantasizing about a divorce. April 7th, 2006, started like any other day in the Campbell household. Liz made breakfast for the family, helped their daughters get ready for school, and spent the afternoon preparing for a church committee meeting that evening. She had no way of knowing that her husband had already decided this would be her last day alive. David's plan was methodically crafted. He'd been researching ways to make a murder look like suicide for weeks. He'd borrowed medical books from the local library under the guise of preparing sermons about mental health. He'd been careful to document Liz's supposed depression, telling church members that she'd been struggling since the death of their infant daughter 7 years earlier. He was creating a narrative that would explain why a devoted Christian mother might take her own life. That evening, after Liz returned from her committee meeting, David suggested they watch a movie together. It was a normal request, the kind of thing a loving husband might suggest. But David had already crushed up sleeping pills and mixed them into Liz's favorite tea. As they sat on their couch, Liz drinking her tea and talking about plans for the church's upcoming fundraiser, she had no idea that her husband was watching her, waiting for the medication to take effect. By 11:15 p.m., Liz was drowsy. She told David she was going to bed, and he helped her to their bedroom, playing the part of the caring husband. But once Liz was unconscious from the sleeping pills, David Campbell revealed the monster he'd been hiding all along. He pressed a pillow over her face and held it there until she stopped breathing. Then, in a final act of calculated cruelty, he arranged her body to make it look like she'd taken her own life. At 11:45 p.m., David called Vanessa. His voice was calm, almost cheerful. "It's done," he said simply. Vanessa asked what he meant, and David replied, "Liz is gone. She won't be coming between us anymore." The reality of what had happened hit Vanessa like a physical blow. The man she'd been having an affair with had just confessed to murdering his wife, and she had become an unwilling accomplice to the most heinous crime imaginable. At midnight, David called 911. His performance was Oscar-worthy. He sobbed into the phone, telling the dispatcher that he'd returned from getting gas for his car and a movie from the video store to find his wife dead in their bedroom. He claimed she'd left him a note saying she couldn't live with the pain anymore. When paramedics arrived, they found David cradling Liz's body, weeping, and asking God why he'd allowed such a tragedy to happen. Detective Marcus Vega had been working cases in Cedar Springs for 15 years, but nothing had prepared him for the scene he encountered at the Campbell house that night. On the surface, everything looked like a textbook suicide. There was a note written in what appeared to be Liz's handwriting. There were prescription sleeping pills on the nightstand. Liz was lying peacefully on her bed, as if she'd simply gone to sleep and never woken up. But something didn't feel right to Vega. In his experience, women who committed suicide rarely chose sleeping pills alone. They usually left longer, more detailed notes. And there was something about David Campbell's behavior that set off alarm bells. He was grieving, certainly, but there was a performance quality to his grief that struck the detective as odd. It was as if David was playing the role of the devastated widower rather than actually being one. The medical examiner's initial report supported the suicide theory. Liz had a lethal amount of sleeping medication in her system, and there were no obvious signs of foul play. But Vega wasn't satisfied. He began interviewing church members, neighbors, and family friends, trying to build a complete picture of Liz's mental state in the weeks before her death. What he discovered didn't match David's narrative at all. Nobody described Liz as depressed or suicidal. In fact, multiple people mentioned that she'd seemed happier recently, talking excitedly about plans for a family vacation and a new Bible study program she wanted to start at the church. Liz's sister was particularly adamant that suicide was impossible. Liz would never leave her daughters, she told Vega. She'd fight through anything rather than abandon those girls. Vega also noticed inconsistencies in David's story. The timeline didn't quite add up. Security cameras at the gas station where David claimed to have been showed no record of him being there that night. The video store clerk didn't remember seeing him either. When Vega questioned David about these discrepancies, the pastor became defensive, claiming that his grief was making it hard for him to remember details clearly. But the investigation stalled when the medical examiner officially ruled Liz's death a suicide. Without clear evidence of foul play, Vega had no choice but to close the case. David Campbell buried his wife with great ceremony, delivering a moving eulogy about how depression can afflict even the most faithful believers. The community rallied around him and his daughters, bringing casseroles and offering prayers. Most people believed David was the victim of an unthinkable tragedy. Only Vega suspected that he might actually be its perpetrator. In the months following Liz's death, David Campbell's behavior began to raise eyebrows throughout Cedar Springs. For a man who'd supposedly lost the love of his life to suicide, he seemed to recover remarkably quickly. Within 6 months, he was seen around town with Vanessa Reed, introducing her as a friend who was helping him through his grief. By the 1-year anniversary of Liz's death, they were practically inseparable. The church congregation was divided. Some members felt it was too soon for their pastor to be moving on, especially with a woman who was obviously more than just a friend. Others defended David, arguing that he deserved to find happiness again and that God wouldn't want him to live in perpetual mourning. But everyone noticed that Vanessa seemed nervous and uncomfortable whenever anyone mentioned Liz's name. David and Vanessa's relationship moved quickly. He proposed to her 18 months after Liz's death, claiming that God had shown him it was time to start a new chapter. They were married in a small ceremony at the church, with many of the same people who'd attended Liz's funeral now witnessing David's new beginning. It should have been a happy occasion, but there was an undercurrent of unease that many guests couldn't shake. What none of the wedding guests knew was that Vanessa was living in a private hell. Every night she was haunted by David's confession and her own complicity in his crime. She'd tried to convince herself that she'd misunderstood what he meant that night when he called her, but deep down she knew the truth. She was married to a murderer, and she was the only person alive who knew it. David's control over Vanessa intensified after their marriage. He monitored her phone calls, tracked her movements, and isolated her from potential friends. When she showed signs of emotional distress, he would remind her of how much she meant to him and how God had brought them together. But he also made subtle threats about what might happen to people who betrayed him. Vanessa understood that she wasn't just David's wife. She was his prisoner. The situation became even more complicated when Vanessa realized she wanted to have children with David. The idea of bringing a child into the world with a man who'd killed his first wife filled her with horror, but she also couldn't imagine ending their marriage without revealing why. She felt trapped in a nightmare of her own making, bound to a monster by her own guilt and fear. Everything began to change in 2010, 4 years after Liz's death. Vanessa's emotional state had deteriorated to the point where she was having panic attacks and couldn't sleep. She'd lost weight, developed nervous habits, and had become increasingly isolated from everyone around her. David's control over her had become suffocating, and she was beginning to realize that she might not survive much longer if she continued living with the secret. The breaking point came when David started talking about having another child. The idea of bringing an innocent baby into their toxic marriage filled Vanessa with such horror that she knew she had to act. She began reaching out to friends she'd lost touch with, trying to rebuild connections that David had forced her to abandon. Slowly, carefully, she started planning her escape. But David noticed the changes in Vanessa's behavior and became increasingly suspicious. He accused her of having an affair, of being ungrateful for everything he'd given her, of being just like Liz in her disloyalty. The comparison to Liz was the final straw for Vanessa. She realized that David saw her as just another obstacle to be eliminated when she became inconvenient. In a moment of desperation and courage, Vanessa did something she'd been too terrified to do for 4 years. She called Detective Vega and asked to meet with him privately. She told him she had information about Liz Campbell's death, information that would change everything. Vega, who'd never stopped believing that Liz's death was suspicious, agreed to meet her immediately. When Vanessa walked into the police station that October morning, she was shaking so violently that she could barely speak. But once she started talking, the words poured out like water from a broken dam. She told Vega about her affair with David, about his confession the night Liz died, about the months of psychological abuse that followed, and about her growing fear that she would be next if she didn't speak up. Vega listened with growing amazement and horror. Everything Vanessa told him matched his original suspicions about the case. Her testimony provided the missing pieces of the puzzle he'd been trying to solve for 4 years. But he also knew that Vanessa's word alone wouldn't be enough to build a murder case. They would need physical evidence, and after 4 years, that evidence might be impossible to find. With Vanessa's testimony as a starting point, Detective Vega launched a new investigation into Liz Campbell's death. This time, he had the advantage of knowing what to look for. He ordered Liz's body to be exhumed for a more thorough autopsy, using advanced forensic techniques that hadn't been available in 2006. The new autopsy revealed crucial evidence that had been missed the first time. There were microscopic fibers in Liz's lungs that were consistent with pillow stuffing. There were also signs of petechial hemorrhaging in her eyes, indicating that she'd been smothered. The original coroner had attributed these signs to the effects of the sleeping pills, but the new medical examiner recognized them as evidence of asphyxiation. Vega also re-examined the crime scene with fresh eyes and new technology. He discovered that the suicide note, while written in Liz's handwriting, contained subtle differences from her normal writing patterns. Experts determined that the note had likely been written under duress, or while Liz was in a compromised mental state. This supported Vanessa's claim that David had drugged his wife before killing her. The investigation team also found inconsistencies in David's financial records. In the months before Liz's death, he'd been making large cash withdrawals and had taken out a significant life insurance policy on his wife. He'd also been researching divorce lawyers, despite his claims that their marriage was happy. These discoveries painted a picture of a man who'd been planning his wife's death for months. Perhaps most damaging was the testimony of other church members who came forward once news of the investigation spread. Several women revealed that David had made inappropriate advances toward them, using the same manipulation techniques he'd used on Vanessa. His pattern of predatory behavior toward vulnerable women became clear, establishing a history that supported the prosecution's case. As the evidence mounted, Vega felt confident that he finally had enough to arrest David Campbell. But he wanted to be absolutely certain, because he knew he would only get one chance to make the charges stick. David was still a respected member of the community, and many people would have trouble believing that their beloved pastor was capable of murder. On a cold November morning in 2010, David Campbell was leading a prayer meeting at Grace Community Church when Detective Vega walked through the sanctuary doors. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Here was a man who'd been preaching about redemption and forgiveness, about to be arrested for the murder of his first wife. David's reaction to the arrest was telling. Instead of the shock and confusion you'd expect from an innocent man, he displayed an eerie calm. He asked if he could finish leading the prayer before they took him away, as if being arrested for murder was just another interruption in his busy schedule. When Vega read him his rights, David smiled and said, "I've been expecting this for a long time." The news of David's arrest sent shockwaves through Cedar Springs. Church members couldn't believe that the man who'd comforted them through their darkest moments was capable of such evil. Many continued to support him, organizing prayer vigils and raising money for his legal defense. They chose to believe that David was being framed, that Vanessa Reed was a jealous woman trying to destroy a good man. But others began to remember things differently. They recalled how quickly David had moved on after Liz's death, how controlling he'd been with Vanessa, how he'd always seemed to need to be the center of attention. Some members of the congregation admitted that they'd had uncomfortable feelings about David for years, but had dismissed them as uncharitable thoughts about a man of God. Vanessa Reed found herself in an impossible position. Half the town viewed her as a hero for finally speaking the truth. The other half saw her as a home wrecker and liar who was destroying an innocent man's life. She received death threats from David's supporters and had to move away from Cedar Springs for her own safety. The courage it had taken to come forward was costing her everything she'd built in the small town she'd hoped would be her sanctuary. The case against David Campbell would hinge entirely on Vanessa's testimony. There was no DNA evidence, no fingerprints, no smoking gun that could definitively prove he'd murdered his wife. Everything depended on whether a jury would believe the word of a woman who'd had an affair with the defendant and waited 4 years to report a murder. The prosecution knew it would be an uphill battle, but they also knew that justice for Liz Campbell was worth the fight. The trial of David Campbell began in January 2011 and quickly became the most sensational case in the county's history. The courtroom was packed every day with church members, reporters, and curious observers who wanted to see how the story would end. David had hired an expensive defense team that immediately went on the attack, painting Vanessa Reed as an unstable woman who was lying to get revenge on a man who'd rejected her. The prosecution's case was methodical and compelling. They walked the jury through the timeline of events, highlighting the inconsistencies in David's story and presenting the forensic evidence that proved Liz had been murdered. They brought in expert witnesses who testified about the patterns of domestic abuse and the psychology of killers who use their positions of trust to manipulate others. But it was Vanessa's testimony that became the centerpiece of the trial. For 2 days, she sat on the witness stand and told the jury everything. She described her affair with David, his growing obsession with eliminating his wife, his confession the night of the murder, and the years of psychological torment that followed. Her testimony was raw, emotional, and utterly convincing. The defense tried everything to discredit Vanessa. They questioned why she'd waited 4 years to come forward. They suggested she was mentally unstable and had imagined David's confession. They painted her as a desperate woman who'd made up an elaborate story to explain away her own guilt about her affair. But Vanessa held firm under cross-examination, never wavering from her account of what had happened. David never took the stand in his own defense, which many observers saw as an admission of guilt. How could an innocent man not proclaim his innocence to the world? Instead, his lawyers focused on creating reasonable doubt, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial and that Vanessa's testimony alone wasn't enough to convict a man of murder. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning their verdict. When the foreman announced that they'd found David Campbell guilty of murder in the 1st degree, the courtroom erupted in gasps and sobs. Liz's family wept with relief, finally getting the justice they'd fought for 5 years to achieve. David showed no emotion as he was led away in handcuffs. His life as a respected minister and community leader officially over. David Campbell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He continues to maintain his innocence to this day, claiming that he's the victim of a conspiracy orchestrated by a vindictive ex-lover and an overzealous police force. He's filed numerous appeals, all of which have been unsuccessful. He spends his time in prison writing letters to anyone who will listen, still trying to convince the world that he's been wrongly convicted. Vanessa Reed disappeared from public view after the trial ended. She changed her name, moved to another state, and tried to rebuild her life far away from the tragedy that had consumed her for so many years. In a final interview before she vanished from the media spotlight, she said, "I know some people think I should have spoken up sooner, and they're right. But I was terrified, and I was trapped, and I didn't know how to escape. I hope Liz can forgive me for waiting so long to tell the truth." The Grace Community Church struggled to survive the scandal. Many members left, unable to reconcile their faith with the evil that had been perpetrated by their spiritual leader. The church eventually hired a new pastor and began the long process of healing, but the community of Cedar Springs was forever changed by the revelation that they'd been fooled by a man who preached love while planning murder. Liz Campbell's daughters, now adults, have chosen to live their lives away from the public eye. They've never spoken publicly about their father's crime or their mother's murder. One can only imagine the trauma of learning that the man who raised them was also the person who killed their mother. They deserve privacy, peace, and the chance to build lives free from the shadow of their father's evil. Detective Vega retired a few years after the trial, but he still considers the Campbell case one of the most important of his career. "It taught me to trust my instincts," he says. "Sometimes the evidence tells you one thing, but your gut tells you something else. In this case, my gut was right. Liz Campbell deserved justice, and I'm glad we were finally able to give it to her.